All, welcome to the Archives in Crisis series. My name is Dr. Liz Skilton. I'm an assistant professor in the history department at the University of Louisiana, Lafayette. I'm also the co-director of the Gilbo Center for Public History, which is new to our history department and the university as of this year. Welcome. The Archives in Crisis series is an 8-week series meant to be an in-depth course on how to respond to two very distinct problems facing our state, particularly related to crises. These include what you would consider rapid onset crises, such as hurricanes and floods that we deal with quite regularly in this region, as well as slow occurring crises, everything from humidity to water to heat in our archives. This series is meant to address these issues and to provide some additional training, facilities, and experts to talk about how best to respond to these crises we face within our archives. I began working on this initiative in 2016 with the Louisiana Historical Association's committee on the archives in Louisiana. And from there, as a history department, we have dedicated resources through the writing of particular grants and the establishment of the Gilbo Center for Public History and this year-long initiative, including this workshop series, to address this issue. It is something that I firmly believe, and I know others in this room can agree, is what our state faces the most challenges with regarding our archives moving forward. We have a lot of different things going on throughout the state, and every region of the state has experienced these kind of crises and is expressing a desire for more training and resources to help us solve them. And so that's the whole purpose of this series. To give you a little bit of background about the series itself, it's funded by a grant that Dr. Ian Beamish and myself got from the Louisiana Board of Regents to both create the Center for Public History, the Gilbo Center for Public History, and to put on this series. So every speaker as part of the series is funded through this grant, and we are incredibly grateful to the Louisiana Board of Regents Support Fund for assisting us in bringing in these speakers from around the country. Each week, we look at a different theme related to our archives and crises. Today's theme is going to be on on storage and management within the archives. Next week, we're moving to indigenous environmental activism, and then from there to other themes, including grant writing, oral history after crises, storage problems, and how to make, for instance, a disaster plan for your various institution. Anything you could think of, we have tried to mesh into the series, and hopefully it will be of help. There are a couple other people that I want to point out before I turn things over for the introduction of our wonderful speaker today, which we're all very excited to hear from. That's Natalie Elder. In terms of thank yous, I'd like to mention again the Louisiana Board of Regents, the Gilbo Center for Public History, the Gilbo Charitable Trust, which also supported this series, AOC Media, which is in the back and filming this series all 8 weeks for us to put online and stream to our colleagues around the state and even around the country, maybe even the world, who are unable to be with us for all 8 weeks in the series. In addition, you'll be able to access the link afterwards. So if you miss anything today, you'll be able to go back and watch it again or to show it to others who were unable to be here. So we're very thankful for AOC. I'd also like to thank the Light Center for allowing us to use this space, the University of Louisiana of Lafayette for supporting this series, and particularly our 2 graduate assistants in the Gilbo Center for Public History. I'll have them stand up and just kind of wave at you. Our first assistant is Julia Fontenot. And our second assistant is Summer Abukamra. Both of these graduate assistants are the reason that we are here today. They helped us research the series. They have publicized it. They've written everything that you have seen related to it, and they're going to be walking around taking pictures. We owe them a serious debt of gratitude for their efforts to get this series actually in place. So thank you to you both. That being said, we've covered our thank yous, the introduction of the series, and a little bit of history on it. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ian Beamish to introduce our speaker, and we'll get moving today. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, thanks to Dr. Skelton as well. As Dr. Skelton mentioned, Julia and Summer have done a great job helping us out and doing a lot of the work for this series. And I'd also like to recognize my co-directors at the Gilbo Center, Dr. Skelton, as well as beside her, Dr. Marissa Petru over there. I'm excited for everything to get started. We're getting started with our first speaker here, Natalie Elder, who is Curator of Cultural Properties at the Chesney Medical Archives of Johns Hopkins Medicine, Nursing, and Public Health, where she stewards a collection of fine art, medical instruments, and artifacts relating to the history of medicine. Previously, she's been the collections manager at the Colorado Historical Society and collections manager and curator at the National Museum of American History's Division of Armed Forces History and Numismatics. She has over a decade of experience with collections ranging from railway cars to flapper dresses to General Custer's laundry hamper. So we'll enjoy her talk, but I think also you'll have an opportunity to ask her questions, and she has a lot of varied experience no matter what your collections are. I think she'll have an idea about how you could store it. And today she's going to talk to us in particular about storage, which is probably one of the first things we think about with archives and archival problems. So I think it's a fitting way to kick off our series. So with that, I'll turn it over to Natalie Elder.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here today, and I'd like to thank Dr. Ian Beamish and Dr. Liz Skelton for having me, and the Gilbo Center for Public History for supporting this series. Also, thank you to the graduate students. I know how much work you've put into this, and we all appreciate it. As this is a series on archives in crisis, I'd like to talk a little bit first about, I think, the most pervasive crisis for collecting institutions, which is that we don't have enough space for our stuff. I have yet to see or work at or visit an institution that has extra space or even enough space, or that could not do with a little reorganization and efficiency in order to protect its collection. So first I want to kind of talk about what collection storage is and what it isn't. And I think that the scope of collection storage we need to think about in a very broad way. It's often not just the storage room where you have your archives and artifacts. It's all of your collection that you hold in trust for the public, and it includes items that are on exhibit and loan. It includes the items on your desk. You know, that happens a lot. We're cataloging something or researching something, and sometimes something sits on your desk for a month or more, and you know, you've got to consider at that point that you're really storing that object there. There are things that maybe you have in the hallway because they're oversized and they don't fit in your collecting areas. And I even try to think about storage as the homes of our prospective donors, because those are the items that you know that you're going to receive in the future. And a lot of times we do have donors that we know in a few years they're going to give us a box of treasures. So we always need to keep that in the back of our mind, like, where is that stuff going to go? Where are we going to put it? The other thing about storage is that it's also digital. It is your collections management database, and I'm talking about if you have a fancy database or if you're using an Excel spreadsheet or if you have a ledger. That's obviously not digital itself, but these are the things that also take up space. It's servers that will increasingly store born digital things, but also that store the photos of your collection items or scans of your documents. It's oral histories, it's moving images, I even think of my iPhone camera roll as storage. I go and check out an exhibit that we just put up and take a photo of what the objects look like so that in a couple of months when the exhibit comes down, I can make sure that they haven't been damaged. That is storage as well. So these are all things that, and then sometimes your camera phone is full, and what are you gonna do? How are you gonna take those photos? So I want us to think about all of those things, and I think that that is important, and I think that people who work in collections kind of understand this intuitively, but I think that we need to start communicating that to our boards of directors and people in leadership at our institutions. The other thing about storage that I see is obvious, but I always reiterate, is that it is finite. You cannot keep everything. There's not, even digital storage is finite. Every other month at our institution, we're upping our server capacities because we're scanning a lot of documents, and that takes up a lot of space. That costs money. These are things that you have to think of as sort of non-renewable resources. There's only so much to go around. So we're talking about not having enough space, and I think that that starts with being honest about the problem. So again, that's why I'm asking you to think about all of the things. Like if there is an emergency and you have to deinstall an exhibit quickly, where are all those items going to go? So that's why I want you to think about all of these various places that your collections exist as storage, because it's serving as storage whether or not they're in a storage room on a shelf. So I think we have to be honest about the problem and aware of the difficulties. But I also think that it's important to think about what would it take to remedy your particular issues in your particular institutions. And I ask us to think about this because it's not just collection managers, archivists, and curators who need to be aware of the problem. It is essential to let your director and your boards know, and to invite people into collection areas, not just for fun behind-the-scenes tours, but also so that they can see the problems that you might have. You could probably use more space. You might need an upgrade in storage furniture. You might need a better system to handle humidity fluctuations. Whatever it is that your particular storage needs are, invite people in to see the problem firsthand. And if you're lucky, and you've thought about what it would take to fix this problem, someone might ask you, what do you need? And then you'll have an answer ready for them, and you'll have an idea of what it would take, how much money it would cost, the amount of time it would take, what materials you would need. All of these things are kind of important to just not only recognize the problem, but how would you fix it? And then be able to communicate that effectively to people who might be able to help you solve that problem. The second point I'd like to make about storage is that it's not static. We have sort of romantic notions that there is a treasure languishing on a dusty shelf somewhere just waiting to be found, or that things sort of languish away in storage untouched for decades. This is often true of your attic or your garage. This is not really true of most institutional storage. Our spaces are constantly changing with exhibits and loans, with storage renovations, with rehousing and organizing, and with circulating to our patrons. So I know that my storage room never looks the same on any given day. And I bet that's true of most of your organizations as well. So I think this is another good thing to kind of communicate to people, that your collection is dynamic, and it's being used, and it's being processed, and it's being researched, and it's being cared for, and that means that things are constantly moving around. There are big collections moves where you have to move to a new building, and that's a big project, and you spend a lot of time thinking about it, but they're just small little moves every day that happen. You put something on a different shelf, and you update its location, or you decide you're going to do some research on a particular artifact, so you take it out of storage. And I think it's important to communicate that. I mean, I think most of us who work in collecting institutions kind of instinctively know that, but I think that's another thing that we need to be better about communicating to other people. I mean, I know it's, it's fun to think about, like, what if, what would be discovered in here? But most of us actually know what we have, and we've cataloged it. So it's not a matter of discovery, it's a matter of sharing your objects and your documents with other people. And really communicating that your collections are active, that they are being used. There are a lot of places that have items in temporary storage, space rather than permanent storage. And this is, so I'll digress a little bit. This is an idea that I think needs to go the way of a permanent exhibition. We used to, in the museum world, I think people often called exhibitions permanent if they were up for 15 to 20 years. That's about the longest that most people have a particular exhibit up. After that, the history maybe is interpreted differently, or you've added to the collection, things change, you want to refresh. The problem with calling it a permanent exhibit is when you take it down, some people are upset because they thought that it was always going to be there. So I think we've gotten better about communicating that about exhibits, but I think we also need to communicate that about storage, that nothing is permanent. You're always going to have moves, you're going to have budget crises, you're going to have emergencies, environmental disasters, or maybe you're really lucky and you get some funding and you get to upgrade. Things are always moving around. So I think the idea of temporary versus permanent storage needs to be something that we're rethinking. Lastly, I want to talk about what storage is not. So in areas that are designated as collection storage, you should only store items that are in the collection. Things end up in storage rooms like old exhibit graphics or props, picture frames, and this kind of stuff sort of accumulates, and it creates two problems. It's a waste of your storage space, but it also creates confusion about what you have a fiduciary duty to and what isn't part of your collection. So you don't want to have things in a dedicated storage area that aren't part of your permanent collection, that aren't legally. An accession is like a sort of legal term that means that you've adopted this item into your collection and you are holding it in the public trust. So the things that you're not doing that for, the things that you aren't holding in public trust, if you put them in areas where objects, artifacts, and documents are, it does create some uncertainty. And you know that that's an old exhibit poster, but in 20 years, someone might not know that. And so I'm going to show us a couple slides in a second, and you can kind of see what happens when you're not very clear about what's in your collection, what an object is, and what even a storage room is. I'm going to show some slides here. So clear labeling is essential. It's hard to see here. This shelf is labeled Unit 11, Unit 04. Now, I used to know what this meant. This is from the National Museum of American History and the Numismatics vault, and it's a collection of, oh, I was going to get this wrong. It's basically a collection of banknote proofs. In any event, I used to know what this means, but this isn't very clear. If someone walks into your storage room, what do you mean it's Unit 11 and Unit 4? This is not intuitive. So you want to make things intuitive for people who, might not understand it, and for people who come after you that are like, what is that? I don't understand how this works. I don't understand these locations. So again, clear labeling. This is one of my favorite signs. This is from the Division of Armed Forces History, had a naval history room. And we had a lot of artifacts from shipwrecks. This is a particular collecting drive by a curator who was interested in that. And he had this sign made that says underwater reference area. And what he meant is the artifacts came from underwater. But as you can see, without knowing that, you don't know what this storage space is. And if it is in fact underwater or not, it wasn't, thankfully. I'm gonna skip this one really quickly. This is an example of dense storage. These are compact shelves, and then on the back you can see hat boxes. And I have this in here because I think it demonstrates how to use vertical space. I know that at a lot of places we don't like to put things up high because we don't like to get on ladders and have to bring them down. Unfortunately, I think that you really need to use vertical space. I've spent a lot of time on a safety ladder, and I'm sure many of you have as well, but it does maximize your use of space very nicely. Let me go back to this. So this is an example. The red's not showing up here, but what this tag says is FIC dot and then a series of numbers. So FIC refers to found in collections. You can see that it's like a furniture leg, I think, a table leg perhaps, or a chair leg. And found in collections means that you're going through and you're inventorying your artifacts or your documents, and you find something and you don't know what it is. It doesn't have a number on it. There's no documentation about it. You don't know who gave it to you. You don't know where it came from. And this is an unfortunate reality in a lot of places because previous generations weren't able to catalog all of their items, or in this case, I think this might just be something that got mixed up with the permanent collection and actually wasn't meant to be in the collection. But because of this uncertain legal status, because you don't know what it is, it's more difficult to deaccession it, which means to remove it from your collection. And it's also taking up space and resources. And as you can see, this is not a very compelling piece to have. Like, this is, Now, here's the thing. If this were the table leg from the table that the Appomattox surrender was signed, that would be a different thing, right? But you don't know that about this object, and you're probably never going to be able to figure that out. So again, clear labeling, clear histories of objects, clear provenance, clear title to objects is very important. Otherwise, you have a lot of table legs that you don't know what to do with. So I'll show you another photo of it. There it is, FIC 6325. And those are sequential numbers, I believe, so that's a lot of found in collections. The other thing about clear labeling, okay, so this is a group of artifacts from Horsley Gant. He was a Hopkins doctor who studied in Russia with Pavlov. So in going through some of his documents, my coworker, who's the collections manager archivist, found these objects in a box on the shelf in the archival storage area. And she said, okay, these are obviously not archives. I'll give them to Natalie, and what will she do with them? I've got another photo of them here. Now, as you can see, a lot of this stuff aren't things that you would want to keep. There's broken glass. There's a broken stopwatch. And I mean, this is one of those things, how do you decide? Was a stopwatch important in his research? Did he use it all the time? Or was it just some junk from his desk? So when we don't know the answers to those questions, it's very difficult to make decisions about what should be in your collection. And so that kind of brings me to my next point. So this is a situation that often happens at museums, and these were some chairs that somebody didn't want anymore, and I'm not quite sure why they put debris on them. We usually just labeled things as trash, but you have to do this because we actually did have collection items in the hallway. And there were times when building maintenance would come around and they don't know whether it's a collection item or not. This particular museum had a range of artifacts and objects. So, it's very important to clearly label things so that things aren't getting thrown out that aren't supposed to. All right, so the second part of it, so that's what storage is. That's how I try to think about storage. The second part of this is a little bit more philosophical, and it's maybe even a little bit radical, but I'm going to propose kind of an extreme policy just to open up our thinking about collecting. Many places have legacy issues or collections and problems that exist because the people that came before us had a different approach, and because each collection is comprised of items that were saved in a political environment and a time other than our own. So this is to be expected. One of the main approaches in the past, indeed the main mode of collecting when the modern museum emerged in the 19th century, was an encyclopedic or type approach to collecting. And what I mean by that is you're interested in collecting every single type of a particular thing. Archivists, I think, have always been better about this because they take collections with the understanding that things will be weeded out, and that's very clearly communicated to donors, that the archivists are going to be making decisions about what to keep and what not to keep. This applies a little bit more to artifacts because of their individual nature. So in the case of artifacts, museums, this is an example from the American History Museum had an exhibit, and I'm sorry I couldn't find a photo of it, but they had an exhibit in the 60s, and it was called the Hall of Typewriters. And it was literally a wall of typewriters and a label explaining what the model was. And that may seem funny now. I think that probably at the time, it was perhaps interesting and showed a particular technological development. But unless you are a typewriter museum, you do not need every type of typewriter to illustrate typewriting technology, right? So, but this is an approach that people often took. Another example is curators go in to collect a doctor's office after he's retiring. So they're collecting records, and they're collecting photographs, and they're collecting artifacts. But it's easy sometimes to when you're on site and collecting in that way, to take everything and then figure it out later. So you end up with things like business card holders, pens and pencils, like everything from someone's desk. Just take it all out, throw it in a box, we'll bring it in, decide about it later. I think that's a dangerous approach, and you end up, it's hard once something walks in the door to get it, to remove it. So I think we need to be judicious in what we let come into our collection spaces. I think that's one of the best ways to address a crisis. And I'm not the first to suggest this, but I am supportive of the shift in the museum community where we're really looking at collecting narratives rather than types, so collecting stories. When an artifact or a document or a photograph elegantly encapsulates an entire story, that is the thing worth saving. That is what's worth saving. Additional documentation concerning this item is important for context and provenance. But if you have a particularly good object, let's see if I can find this. Oh, yeah, there it is. Sorry, I'm in this picture. It's the only one I have of it, though. This is Arthur Ashe's tennis racket. Now, obviously, that's a really cool thing to have. It speaks to his career. It speaks to the history of the sport. But if you have this tennis racket and you have some iconic photographs, and say you have some administrative records from venues where he appeared, you don't need to keep things like his parking stubs, his toothbrush, or the loose change from his bedside table. And that didn't occur in this particular case, but I have seen cases where such varied things are included in their collection. And, I think we can all imagine a case for keeping Arthur Ashe's toothbrush. I'm not sure what that would be, but I bet we could come up with something. But we need to also be able to make cases for collections that we do not want, and that we cannot waste resources on. And I think this is difficult. It's always difficult to turn a donor down, but ultimately people who work in collections are the best advocate for those collections. And so we do need to develop ways to say this isn't appropriate, or we have a policy where we don't collect this particular sort of item. One of the institutions I worked with, we had a policy that we weren't collecting any more wedding dresses unless they belonged to someone of note or they illustrated a particular story. But we weren't just going to collect wedding dresses to have wedding dresses anymore. They took up a huge amount of room. We had good examples from probably every decade in the 20th century and some decades in the late 19th century. And so that policy makes it easier when a donor wants to give you something to say, I'm sorry, this is a great thing, but it's not appropriate for our collections, and we have a policy that doesn't allow us to take this in. And again, that's difficult, and it's not always going to work. There are always going to be situations where you have to take something for reasons other than it belonging in the collection. And we can talk more about that later, but I think we need to have a lot of thoughtfulness in our collecting. And the other benefit of that, that you're not wasting resources, but when you're thoughtful about what collecting you do, even the smallest archive or museum can be world-class. So you want to think about making your collections very strong and not having a lot of extraneous material, because it does sort of degrade the overall quality of your collections. So really find the things that are powerful and moving and important, focus your time and energy on those, and make sure that the other stuff is you're addressing it and you're also not letting it come in. The best deaccessioning policy to have is a good accessioning policy. If you don't take it in the first place, then you don't have to figure out what to do with it when you realize that you really don't need this in your collection. So my somewhat radical suggestion is that you say no a lot of times. And if you can't say no, that you try to secure from donors the ability to dispose of collections as your institution sees fit. I know that many things end up in collections because someone stopped by on the way to the city dump, or they say, well, I don't know if I want to give these to my children or to you, or there's some uncertainty. It's hard to make split-second decisions on items, and I understand that. So, someone comes by and they're like, well, this stuff is going in the trash if you don't take it. And you look at it and you think, well, I probably don't necessarily want this stuff. And if someone else is throwing it away, exactly, let's assess the value. But sometimes assessing the value of collections takes more than, a couple of minutes that you have with this donor. So in those cases, I think it's important to inform donors that you're taking something on a provisional basis with the caveat that it might not become part of the permanent collection. And that you might dispose of it in any number of ways. This gets a little bit into deaccessioning versus disposition, and that's a whole other talk. And ethical deaccessioning is something that there's been a lot of writing about, but I think it's important to remember that if you haven't made it part of your permanent collection, that different ethical approaches apply. So, let's talk a little bit about market forces. This is another thing that I think we need to talk about when we talk about collections, because they are definitely affected by political climates, by real estate climates, by any number of things, current affairs, things that are going on in the world. So, let's see. Right. So this is from a publication by the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and it's, I love the headline because really this is what archivists and curators do, is they say yes this and no to this. Your job is not to take everything. Your job is to create a collection that is thoughtful and represents your institution and what you're trying, what kind of, it speaks to your mission, essentially, is what you want in your collection. So These are some pretty naval embroideries. So another aspect to this is ethically and in practice, we need to treat all of our objects equally. Collecting institutions they are prevented from law or by law from assigning monetary value to objects. We often have people call us and say, can you tell me how much this is worth? And no, we can't, because that creates a conflict of interest for us. You can direct people to appraisers, but you have to be judicious even in that, because you don't want to appear to be favoring a particular appraiser. So in practice, in theory, all of your objects are the same, but this is not the case. And one of the things that I think we also need to do is to have tiers of things in our collection. This is a flag in the National Museum of American History's collection. It's Old Glory. It was flown in Tennessee defiantly by its owner during the Civil War. We had the opportunity, it's rolled up most of the time, but we were filming it, so we had the opportunity to unroll it and to be able to look at it, which was really neat. But I'm showing you this because this is what we would call a tier 1 artifact. And the way that someone who worked with me used to describe it, and it sounds a little dramatic, but it's that the nation would weep if these tier 1 artifacts were lost. And it is a little over the top, but I do think it's useful to think about things this way. If the building is burning down, what are you grabbing the one thing before you leave? Also, don't risk your life at the expense of collections, please. Human life is always more important. But we need to start thinking about what are our really amazing things and what things are we not going to spend a lot of time or money on. And you still have to be accountable to the public. So you still have to know what you have. You have to be taking care of it. You can't just leave it out in the rain. I mean, you have to store it professionally. But you don't need to, spend a lot of research time on those things. You don't need to spend conservation money on those things. You don't need to, say if you're doing a digitization project, you want to use your money to digitize the things that are outstanding, not just everything. So I think this kind of tier system is useful. And again, if everybody right now can probably think, what's that one thing in their collection? So start thinking of things like that and say, what can I really what would be a shame if we lost it? And then there are tiers below that. Back to market forces. So when I worked in Colorado, this was a couple of years ago, and they had just legalized recreational marijuana. And one of the unintended, not consequences really, but one of the things that happened is that a lot of people were buying up warehouse space so that they could grow the marijuana plants. And all of a sudden, museums were basically priced out of cheap warehouse space to store things. And so I use this as an example because you have to kind of be thinking about things like that. Like, what does it mean that someone has been elected that's maybe really supportive of archives? How does that affect you? What does it mean that, a museum very near or close to your institution is going to be selling some things for profit so that they can support the rest of their collection? Sometimes donors get very angry about that, and they are going to be calling you and asking you, hey, are you doing this? And so you have to be aware of what's going on around you and what's going on in the museum world. This was an example that I found a little while ago. I don't think this actually happened. I think that this issue was dropped. This is from 2016. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Why are we storing something in the French Quarter where there's millions of dollars worth of real estate that's being taken up by these collections that don't necessarily need to be in the quarter. So the other aspect of this, though, is if they sell that space, the funds would actually go back into the general funds and wouldn't necessarily be earmarked for the museum. So the museums were obviously, the State Museum was upset about this because, they were basically going to have to move all of their collections somewhere else and then not receive any profit from it, that money would all go to the state. And there was no legal way to say, yes, you will see a recoup in this expense that you're going to have to do. It's incredibly expensive to move collections. So again, these are all things that we need to be thinking about, particularly in state collections. You need to think about what public officials support you and which ones don't. Okay. So there's a couple of other slides I just want to touch on. Another trick that I have developed over the years is you can hang a lot of things on screens, and it really does free up a lot of space. Obviously, paintings are often stored on screens, but when I was at the Colorado History Museum, you can see it's a pair of horns, and then beneath that is a scythe. So again, these things are like cumbersome and huge and difficult to store, but actually, this is very efficient use of storage space. So again, wall screens are great and can be used for things other than art, as long as they're supported correctly. I also want to talk about over-designed storage. A lot of times you might get in a mood of, we're going to make everything great. So this tennis racket, as you can see, it's on a board where it's labeled Arthur Ashe and then its number. And you can see the Teflon covered Ethafoam supports and Teflon at the top and the bottom. It's very well protected. It's also a little bit of overkill for this object. Now, this is the Smithsonian. The overkill is fine and to be expected in some ways, but you don't have to go this far. A tennis racket is a pretty stable thing. You can put it on a nicely lined shelf, have a tag that labels what it is, and that's probably enough. Additionally, some things really need it. Silk flags are incredibly delicate. They have what we call inherent vice, meaning that they're going to break down no matter what you do. So that's the kind of thing that you want to spend your money and your materials on preserving. So again, and this is something where you want to try to look at your collections in a way that is, you're thinking about material types and not just objects themselves, but what are those objects made of? What kind of storage systems do your wooden artifacts need versus leather artifacts versus paper and photos? The other thing with types of collections that I want to mention is that digitization is wonderful and it allows us to share our resources. It also captures objects and documents and what state they are in so that they can be compared later to see how they're deteriorating. However, a digital version of an artifact does not replace an artifact. You really do need to keep things that that you've digitized. I know that individual places do this differently, but what I will say is that paper lasts a long time. Photographs last for a long time. The digital media that you use to view digital copies of those things degrades very quickly. So if you have a bunch of photos of artifacts on a CD, for instance, and those artifacts are gone, that CD, you'd be hard-pressed to find a computer to read that in. Also, CDs are notorious for degrading very quickly. So digital media changes very quickly, and a lot of these, the hard copies don't, and they last forever. So be careful when you're saying, like, oh, we can just take a picture of it, and then we don't need to keep this. That's something that is maybe not the case. So I've talked a lot about different kind of philosophical strategies to storage and things that I think can help you think about how you can change things for the better in your institution. But I also do want to leave a lot of time for questions so people can ask me about specific types of objects or types of collections. And also we can also talk about relationships between donors and how to navigate things and that sort of thing. So that's pretty much the end of my talk. If we want to open up for questions now. Yes, ma'am. Do you need a microphone?
Okay, she's getting me a microphone. Whenever someone brings, like a donor brings you an object and say, like you gave the wedding dress example, what would you, instead of throwing it away, would you suggest they go to another museum, or what would you tell them?
Yeah, often that is what we do. There are a lot of community museums and smaller institutions that do want these types of objects. So particularly at the National Museum of American History, you get tons of offers and you just can't take everything. But there's no reason why a local museum might not want a World War I uniform. We had hundreds of them. So, they're very well represented in that collection, but they might not be in another collection. And if you know of particular needs in other places, you can absolutely recommend that that they approach those institutions. Do you want to go?
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
As a user of archives and a historian of medicine and science, I'm really interested in your title, Curator of Cultural Properties. That's not something I've ever seen at an archive before. And I realize you have a lot of experience working with museums, but most archivists that I meet are incredibly uncomfortable dealing with artifacts. And they don't want to acknowledge that they have all these three-dimensional unwieldy objects in their collections. Yet as a historian, I love those and I go searching out for those. But they are uncomfortable with how to store them because they're used to dealing with, paper or stacks of paper or books or correspondence, not these unusually shaped objects. So I was wondering, especially because you showed us all of these great images from what I'm assuming are different institutions' storage spaces. If you can talk about maybe ways in which you've drawn from your experience working at museums to help archives, if there are ways in which what you do with working with these historical artifacts are also helpful for people who are working in more traditional archives with, paper objects.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a strange title, and it kind of grew out of my counterpart at the Johns Hopkins University on the Homewood campus. It's a different campus than the medical campus. And, she, I think that they were trying to come up with a title that accurately represented what she did. And probably they didn't want to use material culture. Some people have issues with that term. So they settled on cultural properties, and then probably administratively, that was easy to reproduce to fund a full-term position at my institution. So it's probably more of a bureaucratic thing than anything. But it is odd. I haven't seen it before anywhere else. So one of the things I love about my job, though, is that we are primarily in archives. We have 30,000 cubic feet of documents and photographs. We only have about 15,000 artifacts, and that sounds like a lot, but there are places that have millions and hundreds of thousands of things. So relative to the archives, our artifact collection is small, but the great thing about it is they are very integrated. So we have artifacts, and then we have the documentation, the letters about people using them. We have photographs of the people who used them or produced them. And we try to approach it very holistically so that it's one collection just made up of different types. And I think that that is something that archives need to embrace, because you will find in boxes of letters that someone has given you pressed flowers or, ID badges. I mean, there's all the different types of things in people's collections. People don't think about their own stuff as like paper versus artifacts, right? So you do end up with things. And I think, again, it goes back to this acknowledging that you have it and that you need to do something about it. It is tempting to just say like, well, I'm not comfortable with this, and so I am going to ignore it. But I think it's productive to embrace that sort of thing and to try to learn about them. One of the things that I always reiterate is that artifacts are texts that can be read. You can think about them just like you can think about a document. Who produced this? When was it produced? Who was it for? What was its expected shelf life? All of those things that you do when you're reading a text, you can apply to an object. So I think that can sometimes help people who are uncomfortable with objects, that if they think about them in the ways that you think about texts. Our storage of the archival materials is actually pretty good, and I don't work a lot with that. I do. What I do help them with is oversized things, because a lot of artifacts, and art particularly, are large sizes. So I've been able to help them with like map cases and folders and that sort of thing. But I think archivists actually have, I think they've figured it out about storing archival materials. I think that's it's pretty standardized in a lot of ways. And it's helped by things like standard sizes of papers and standard photograph sizes. Things just have never been produced in that way. They're always different. So it's a little bit of you have to approach things more on an individual level, which does make it more difficult. I would say probably one of the things that more that I've learned from archival collections is really to think about things to think about on a larger level, to try to not think about individual in a storage situation. So when addressing storage problems, you're not just thinking about individual objects, you're thinking about collections and types of things and how you can address things at the collection level rather than at the item level. So does that, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that you're not in charge of you have other people for the archives side of it. What's your team that you work with, and what's your relation to the other teams in that organization?
Yeah, so it's great. I am the curator, so I deal only with, the easiest way to do this is just to say 3D things rather than 2D things. But so I deal with the objects. My coworker is the reference archivist for the cultural properties collection, and so he works with the objects as well, but he also runs our reference program. We have a staff of 8, and it's pretty democratic in the sense that we have one director, and then we're all kind of on an equal level below that, which makes it nice. And then, so we have a digital archivist, an audio-visual archivist who does photos, moving images, and audio. And then a collections management archivist. We have a processing archivist. We have an administrator. And we have a registrar. And I think that's everybody. And then our director, obviously, she does everything. But so that's our team. That's the archives at the Chesney Medical Archives. We work a lot with, in the broader institution, we work a lot with development and alumni relations, because these are often the people that are our donors. And we work a lot with various administrative offices, like the dean's office, or department chairs who want to put on exhibitions related to their particular department's history. So that's our kind of relationship with other people in the organization. A lot of people, this is one of the things that we're trying to address, a lot of people in the medical divisions at Johns Hopkins don't know that we exist, despite the fact that we're one of the largest medical archives in the United States. So people who are doing research in the history of medicine know about us, but our, sort of our own constituents at Johns Hopkins often don't know about us. So we're really trying to increase the hospital and medical campuses' knowledge of what we do and how we can help them.
Thank you so much. I really advocate this chair. I really advocate for a kind of storytelling methodology, like you were mentioning before. I hail from an art museum background. How do you deal with different narratives? Because as better representation from a demographic standpoint, from an object standpoint, from a media standpoint, I'm dealing with potentially folk art, conceptual art, gender, race issues. How have you or other colleagues dealt with dealing with kind of macro narratives at an institutional level and then making them relevant and coherent so they just don't break down at a more kind of micro narrative level on a smaller dealing with specific collections? What's your experience been?
I think you really do have to start with what your organization's mission is. And it depends so much on that, and then it depends so much on what kind of history you cover. There's been an increase in the field to address more difficult topics, and that's something that I think is very important and that we need to do more of, and reinterpreting things in a way that acknowledges their problematic pasts. As micro versus macro, I think you have to, it's an approach in how you yourself are looking at it, and then how can you communicate that to other people. And that's what interpretation is. Putting on an exhibit is saying, I have interpreted these things in this way, and this is the story that I want to tell about them. So if you're thinking of it in that way, I think that translates very well to your exhibitions and to your public output in general, your writings, your talks, that sort of thing. I do definitely advocate for this, collecting stories and collecting narratives and collecting things that really say the thing that you want to say about that particular subject. The other side of this, though, is that I do think that we have to be willing to know that the individual items do have probably different and varied histories than the cohesive story that you're trying to tell. And that sometimes, particularly for difficult objects, you have to acknowledge that history. A firearm is a particular type of technology. It does a particular thing. Different firearms have obviously been used in different ways. So you have to be careful in how you display and talk about those. So I can show you, a long gun and say, this is this particular make and model of this firearm. But if I tell you the context in which it was used, that it gives it a whole other meaning, right? So it really is context and relating things back to what's going on in the wider world, either at the time or right now. So I think you have to make those connections, but also still be aware of the reality of things. I mean, a firearm, it's produced in a particular way. It has a certain shape. It might have a certain beauty to it. Like, all of those things exist at the same time. So I do think it's a little bit holding that in your head, holding those two ideas simultaneously.
Do you possibly have an example of an FIC or a founding collection that you ended up deaccessioning?
Yes. We deaccessioned some at the History of Colorado. And these are things where, so we had, I don't even remember how many book presses. And if you've ever seen an old-fashioned book press, they're huge, and they are very heavy, and they take up a lot of space. And I think we had like 20 of them. And some of them we didn't know where they had come from. They were FICs. Similarly, farm equipment were sometimes found in collections. We didn't know where they were from. And so, those were things that we just kind of made an executive decision that we've documented this, we've done our due diligence, we've looked into the provenance, but we can demonstrate that these are represented in other collections items. So we felt comfortable deaccessioning them. And of course that went to our board and they approve, they either approve it or disapprove it. I think they approved most of those cases. But I think particularly when something is duplicated so much, it's a little bit clearer to do that. You do have to be careful though, because you have a duty to your donors and you have a duty to the public. So it has to be, I think if you can show that you've made a well-considered decision, then it's something that you can definitely do. And I think we need to be realistic and do, I think we all need to deaccession things. There are just things that we do not need anymore, and we should not be afraid to say, we don't need this doesn't fit our mission. So I think it's important.
Do you mind if I add, do you have some examples of the disposal methods that you used for different types?
Yeah, so if it's something that we thought we could auction, we auction it, and then we use that money for collections care or to buy more artifacts. And that's a pretty strict ethical guideline that exists in the museum field. If you sell something, the money from that sale should go into either acquiring objects or direct care for those objects. Same with archives, although auctioning off, I haven't dealt with deaccession of archival material. So, and sometimes if it's damaged, we dispose of it. If it doesn't have a lot of value, we dispose of it. We recycle it if we can. But things that are damaged, you don't want, or alternatively, if you have a fake. So say that you discover that in your collection of CSA belt buckles from the, Confederate States Army, that one of them that's found its way into your collection is a counterfeit. If you get rid of that, you need to destroy it or dispose of it in some way so that somebody else doesn't come across it, think that it's real. And then it also, on top of that, has this museum provenance that it comes with that legitimizes it as a real thing. Now, sometimes counterfeits are great. Like if you have counterfeit Confederate currency, that's a really interesting piece, right? So it's not always the case, but if you're getting rid of something that's damaged or not a genuine artifact, I think it's important to destroy it.
So one thing that I was thinking about in terms of this deaccessioning of items is how we go about getting rid of or disposing items. There we go. Sorry, I'm having trouble today. After a crisis, right? Particularly as you talk about those tier 1 items, the things that we prioritize heavily as part of our collections. How do we make these tough calls? How do we rationalize it to donors? How do we explain what is happening to the items? And in some way, you can see the wear and tear on an item, and in other ways, it's a very clear-cut answer. There's mold, there's mildew, there's severe damage to it. But there's a lot of backstory to the particular item, and maybe it was critical to your collection. So, how does that play a role?
Yeah, these are things that are difficult, but I do think you have to advocate for the health of your collections and the health of your staff. For instance, in the case of mold, if you have something with mold on it, it is not good for you to be around that. There are other things. A lot of collections in the past were treated with arsenic because arsenic is a great bug deterrent. With that kind of thing, it's a little bit easier because arsenic is actually quite difficult to ingest. It's not airborne. You'd have to lick it, perhaps, or eat the object. So you don't, it's not as much of a problem. But I think we do need to be clear that people do come first. And if something is moldy or hazardous in some way, I mean, I have medical collections that are oozing things. I occasionally come across bottles of strychnine. These are things that like I get, you know, I empty them, keep bottles and things, but I definitely get rid of and give those to the hazardous disposal people at the hospital. I know that there are issues with things like nitrite films that can explode and they need cold storage. You know, all of these sorts of things. In those cases, I definitely think that you have to be an advocate for the health and safety of your people. Like, no one needs to die in an explosion for saving an old film. With crises in particular, I think it's very difficult. I just think you have to acknowledge what can be saved and what can't. And of the stuff that can be saved, where are you going to put the money? Because conservation is, you know, very expensive. And there are some things that just are damaged beyond saving. And I think we have to document them and say, these were a part of our collection, they can't be anymore, and we have to remove them. It's going to be interesting in the next couple of decades, all of the plastics that are deteriorating. This is another concern that I have. How are we going to address that in our collections? Things are going to start, I've seen things that look melted. I see things that are just become very brittle and cracked, or become tacky, like they're sticky. You know, all these sorts of things. And some things become unrecognizable when they degrade. So again, this is a case where having like the digital copies of something is great because it's not going to survive. But you just have to be honest with people. I think it is very difficult. It's so sad when you lose something, you know, to some kind of event that you can't control.
Absolutely. As you're mentioning tacky, I'm thinking of Mardi Gras beads, right?
Yeah.
Which a carnival collection will have lots of, but we know you shouldn't keep those.
Yeah, I mean,
but to what extent, right?
Right. They are going to degrade, and there's always more every year, right? So, and there's I like the old, you know, glass ones. Those are nice too. So, but yeah, having good photo evidence and documentation of them so that also you can make reproductions of things. You know, there are things that are one of a kind. You can't reproduce Old Glory, for instance, but other things that you know are going to degrade can be reproduced, particularly for display purposes.
So I have one question, which is, given the sort of theme of our archives in crisis, there's all these, especially smaller institutions in Louisiana that are in sort of a crisis situation where they maybe aren't in a position to deal with best practices yet. So if you go into a situation where an archive has, you know, leaking roofs, staff, no funding for staff, things like this, when you come in sort of thinking of the order of operations or triage, given what you've said in your talk, like how can institutions like this balance sort of trying to do what we might think of more traditionally as preservation, like fixing the environment, treating the objects, versus how much is the first step to actually do what you talked about earlier and think about what is our core collection and how do we pare it down before we start preserving it, or are these processes that are ongoing at the same time?
Yeah, I think to an extent that they are, and this is where, this is where I think you also have to recognize that the perfect is the enemy of the good. In my handout, there's some resources that I included, and a lot of them are very specific and helpful. Some of them, if you go and check them out, they're going to talk about best practices, and you're going to realize like that is not a possibility for your institution. There was a UNESCO resource that I didn't include because I started reading it and I just thought this is only achievable with a new building purpose-built for your collections, and that almost never happens. So, you know, it's not worth trying to achieve that level of, you know, care for your collections. We always, you know, you want to do the best that you can, and then you have to let go. But I do think it's important to think about varying levels in your institution. So you have like outside, right? And then you have the outer walls. And then you have increasing levels of like staff areas, well, public areas, usually exhibition areas, and you have staff areas and offices. And then the heart of your collection is the storage, and it should be the most protected. Storing things on outside walls is not great. Storing things on the floor is a problem, but we all have to do it in some cases, that kind of thing. But I think that, yes, it depends on what you're doing. If you are going in and addressing constant old problems, especially with the building, I think that's something important to do first, because anything that you have in that building, whether it's a tier 1 object or not, is going to be affected by the building environment. I do think if you are, say, moving a collection to a new area, it's worth thinking about what are the things that we want to keep and bring into this new space, and how are we going to design this new space for those things, for those tier 1 things. Instead of thinking like, okay, well, we just got to fit all this in here, right? And this also depends on whether or not you have a good inventory. If you don't know what you have, it's very difficult to make these decisions. So inventorying is important, it's difficult depending on the size of your collection, how to go about that. But there's lots of different strategies. But it really does start with that. You have to know what you have before you can make decisions about it. So, yeah, I mean, ideally everything's happening at the same time, but that's not how the real world is. So, yes, sir.
So my question is, I'm not an archivist. I use archives a lot, and I've overseen archives before. But just to kind of pick your brain, we're in a state where there is very little political interest in archives, if any. And there is also very little funding through other sources to deal with archival materials. And because of that, there seems to be this kind of fundamental problem, which is there's no money. Yeah. And a lot of what needs to be done at heart, we just need the money to do it. I mean, we to some degree, we know what to do.
Yeah.
So do you have any recommendations, or does anybody, on how we might impress upon the people who make decisions about where money goes that this is indeed something important?
Yeah, so this is a situation where in the beginning when I was talking about knowing exactly what you need is often very helpful, because you do not know when some politician or someone in charge or who holds the purse strings is going to come into your organization and maybe be helpful. So I know that that's probably not the reality for most places, and that's like a lucky you hit the jackpot kind of situation. The other thing is that, I mean, you have to be willing to kind of play to their interests. This does work very well. I've worked in a military collection. You can imagine people are very interested in that, and there are people who are very willing to give a lot of money to that. And so, you have to kind of say to politicians, again, inviting them to see your spaces, inviting them to see your challenges. I know that, again, that's not always something that you can do, but you will be surprised sometimes who will accept. And then really educating them about what the problems are and what's going to be lost if these things aren't taken care of. It is hard. Some people just aren't interested in preservation and history in the way that probably all of us in this room are. So again, playing with nostalgia, playing with things from people's lives that they're going to recognize and have an emotional connection with is one of the ways in. And I think that that's totally great. I mean, everybody comes to your collection with a different, set of experiences and preferences and knowledge. And so you have to meet them where they're at, I think. Again, I do think, working towards what they're interested in, and also explaining what will be lost. It's hard for me to give an example of that, but, the big ticket, the tier 1 items in your collection say, like, if this doesn't get taken care of, this thing is not going to exist anymore, and we will have lost a piece of our history. I understand it is very hard, and everybody is strapped for cash. So it's so difficult. But yeah, being ready and prepared when someone does come by with some money is very helpful. And it demonstrates that you know what you're doing and that you know how to advocate for your collection. So anybody else want to share strategies for increasing engagement or funding? I know it's a really difficult topic, something we always agree with.
In past efforts with permanent collection storage upgrades, just doing what you can with what you already have to the, keeping best professional practices in mind, but to your scale of economy and being proactive about it and incorporating that into what you were saying, so that you're not necessarily waiting for someone to come and help you. You're helping yourself to some extent, being your own advocate, and incorporating that strategy was a boon for me at a past position. So you can kind of see, and if it isn't the sexiest solution, but it's a solution, because people love to kind of help you find the right solution if you're being proactive and doing the right thing already.
Absolutely.
So I work for a fairly small Native American tribe. And so now that people know that there is an archive, I get pretty much every time there's a death of a tribal member or anything, I get obituaries. Anytime the tribe is mentioned in the newspaper, I get newspapers emailed and dropped off on my desk. And so now I just have a giant stack of not historical items, and like the mission of our archive is to serve tribal members. And so when they bring stuff, is there a way to go about being like, cool, but I'm okay?
Well, I think what you can do with those types of files is create, they're not necessarily archives, but you create a subject file or a bio file where you just maintain files on people. So, you might have obituaries or articles that where the person is talked about. So that's something that we have in our archives, and those are pretty standard, I think, for a lot of archival institutions. So, you just sort of explain, like, this isn't going into the collection, but it's basically going into our reference collection to support the actual archives, so that when you come across, it's great for me at our archives. I love it. If I come across someone's name in a letter, I don't know who they are. I can look them up in the bio file and then hopefully learn a little bit more about them. I do think it's worth, if the community feels like those things are important, I do think it's worth trying to incorporate them somehow, yeah. But subject and bio files, there's so many problems with subject and bio files. Like, most people can tell you about, like, the issues with those types of collections, but they are useful, and I know they're hard to administrate, but they're very helpful. So it's one of the ways you can address that. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the environment. When you're bringing collections in and you have artifacts and you also have papers, how do you, and they've been stored maybe a place that has bugs or mold or whatever, how do you treat those? And I'm sure it must differ from paper to objects. Could you tell me how y'all deal with that?
Yeah, so the main thing with paper is making sure it's not moldy and that it doesn't have an active infestation of bugs. You'll often find evidence of prior infestations. Those can be cleaned up pretty easily, but if something has an active infestation or active mold on it, don't bring it into your collection before you address that, if at all possible. Certainly segregate that from your other collections. One of the things that's expensive, but one of the things that is nice to have for these sorts of reasons is a deep freeze. And if you can't get a lower temperature, what you can do is do cycles of freezing and warming up. So it takes several weeks, but that's one way to address it. You know, a lot of times if it,
Do you have a freezer? Is that how y'all treat it?
yeah. So, and oftentimes, like at History Colorado, we had a policy that any textile, even if it looked perfect, went into the freezer for 5 days, just because there's so many problems that you might not be able to identify right away, but knowing that there aren't any bugs on that thing when it comes out is super great, because once you get moths or something like that in your collection, that's terrible. You know, like you're really going to cause a lot of harm to your textiles. So yeah, anything with active problems like that, you want to keep as far away from your collection as possible. Mold, one of the things I did recently, we had a Foot Locker from the Vietnam War, I believe. Maybe World War II, I can't remember. No, it was World War II. From one of our doctors who later went on to advocate against the use of violence and advocate against like military intervention. And so it's kind of cool because it showed that he had this, you know, history of serving in the military and then, you know, later advocating against the overuse of the military. So it had been sitting on the donor's porch for a long time, and it did have mold problems. And so what I did, this is a lot harder in Louisiana to do, but what you can do to kill the mold. So what we did is I took it outside on days when it was low humidity and put it in the sunlight, and that killed it. So, you know, we didn't have a freezer large enough for that. The thing with mold is it can always reactivate. Once you hit 70, I think it's 77 degrees and 70% humidity, mold is going to start blooming. So, you know, that's something. That's also when rust starts to happen. So those are good numbers to remember, but it's, you know, it's a challenge. I know, especially here with the humidity.
Do we have any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming out and join me in
Yes,
thanking
thank
our
you.
speaker.